What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there, and welcome back to our next segment of understanding injuries. And you as a fantasy football owner need as much information as possible, right? Well, these shows are meant to really help you understand injuries a little bit more. So if you're mid-season and one of your players suffers from one of these injuries, what can you expect? What's the percent of re-injury risk? What does this mean? What kind of limitations may they have? And in today's episode, we're talking about hamstrings, one of the most difficult injuries to try to figure out during your fantasy football season. But I'm no doctor, so let's head over and talk to Dr. Ethan Turner in our next segment of What's Up, Doc? All right, welcome in Dr. Ethan Turner, our next segment of Understanding Injuries, and we're talking about hammies. Now, I love ham, Ethan. I like ham. I like holiday ham, but I don't think we're talking about that type of ham, are we?
No, we are not, but I also love ham. So, as long as you love ham, it's all good.
All right, well, maybe if we get through this show quick enough, we can talk about a little bit of ham. No?
Yeah,
probably not.
We can ham it up.
We ham it up together. That's right. All right, so let's start off with what is a hamstring strain? And it's hard enough to say. You hear a lot of people say, oh, they pulled a hammy or pulled a hamstring. At my age, that usually means that an overage guy was playing softball and pulled a hamstring running to first.
Or you got out of bed too fast. I mean, really, it could be anything.
Doesn't take much these days.
Strain. Yeah. So strain basically just means a tear or a stretch. It sounds worse when you say it like that. When you say hamstring strain, everyone's like, hamstring strain. That's not really a big deal. When you say it's a hamstring tear, then you go, oh, that sounds more serious. And it is. Basically, it's a stretch or a tear of the muscle belly of one of the three hamstring muscles on the back. So you actually have three separate muscles that make up your hamstrings. I'm not going to go into the medical terminology. You can Google it. But basically, the thing we need to know for fantasy is that it's the second most common NFL injury. It's actually the cause of the second most games missed due to injury right after an ACL tear. So ankle sprains are the most common injury for NFL players. Hamstring strains are the second most common. So this happens very often. This is probably one of the most likely injuries that you're going to deal with as a fantasy owner. Each team on average reports 5 to 7 hamstring strains a year. The re-injury risk is the thing that I think bothers us as fantasy players the most because it's actually super high. Typically that re-injury risk is the highest when they first come back. So in the first 2 weeks after you strain and try to return, that's when you're most likely to re-injure it. So that's what makes this really frustrating, I think, for us, especially because it's like, all right, do I plug this guy in? He plays for 3 snaps and then he hurts it again. Or you think you're going to line him up and then 30 minutes before the game, he pulls it in warm-ups and then you're out and you have to make a very quick switch. That can be super frustrating. I deal with it a lot. I would say that 90% of the time I can tell you if a player is going to play on Sunday based on a Wednesday injury report. It's something I'm really proud of. I track it. Hamstring strains are the 10% that I miss the most often. It's just really hard to predict because you don't know until they basically run at full speed. I don't usually do that until that day. The re-injury risk is about 20 to 30%. That's what studies say. That's a pretty high re-injury chance. And you got to remember that it keeps adding on. So like it's 20 to 30% for each hamstring strain. And after you have it, you re-injure it, it's still 20 to 30% on top of that. And so it can reach even higher the more you re-injure it. That's where you see players that, they injure in week 2 and then they try to come back week 4 and then they're out for like 8 weeks and then their whole season ends up being a wash. That's what happened with Leonard Fournette and Dalvin Cook a few years back. The other thing we need to know is that the highest risk that a player has for a hamstring strain is actually in the first 15 days of training camp. This year, that could maybe potentially be like the first 2 weeks of the season. We don't know what the preseason is going to look like yet, but we know that the risk of these strains is at the highest, basically the first 2 weeks these guys return to camp. A lot of that's due to conditioning and stretching and going back at full speed off the off season. So those are that's kind of what it is and why it's important from an NFL perspective. And some just, little nuggets that I think you can take and know and use as a fantasy player.
Yeah, I mean, they're, like you said, they're so hard to really understand. And you can see that questionable tag next to your player all week long. And you sit there just thinking to yourself, is he going to go? Do I want to risk it? And more times than not, I kind of find myself just saying, listen, because of that possible re-injury risk, that go out there in the first series and pull it and risk missing the entire game, I may be more inclined to, if I have another option, just go with it just to be safe. And sometimes that doesn't work out when it's one of your best players, but sometimes it's just a little bit safer approach depending what other options you have there on your bench.
Yeah, it can save you a week just by being a little bit overcautious. Like I said, pretty accurate when it comes to these injuries and whether or not the guy's going to play or not. But these hamstring strains, man, they really are hard to predict because you don't know unless you're like watching the player
Right.
all week. You don't really know how hard they're going in practice. We don't really know that much. And so trying to predict if they're going to be ready to play or not is a total crapshoot. I mean, nobody really has a good formula for this yet.
So is it like you either have a strained hamstring or you don't, or is there like different stages, different levels of a hamstring strain that you can suffer?
So, like most soft tissue injuries, it's a graded system. So you have a grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. A grade 1 is a pretty mild strain. It's basically just stiffness or tightness. You'll see this sometimes. Guys will, they'll pull out of a practice because they've got hamstring tightness. That's usually a mild hamstring strain. There's not really any swelling. There's some discomfort when they're walking, but it's not really impacting how their leg moves. Usually they still have full range of motion, and they're usually walking looks pretty normal. Like you wouldn't really know that something was wrong with them if they weren't trying to like run at full speed. Recovery for this grade 1 is usually 1 to 2 weeks. But the interesting thing about this is that even with grade 1 strains, MRI results can actually show damage up to 6 weeks out after the injury. So even if it's a mild issue, there could still be tissue changes 6 weeks after the injury. So obviously these guys return very quickly. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily fully healed immediately. Just because they're playing again doesn't mean that this isn't still considered a weak point on their body. Even with no pain, they still usually average, based on the studies, they average about 1 to 2 games missed if they have this like hamstring tightness or a mild hamstring strain. As far as like the grade 2, grade 3, grade 2, you're looking at moderate. This is where you start to notice that their walking is affected. So they're not walking right. You can tell something's wrong. They're favoring that leg a little bit. They tend to have a limp. They tend to have pain with all of their movements. This is where their range of motion is impaired, which means they're usually not extending as much, and they're not bending their knee as much because it hurts. Usually at this stage, the pain is relieved if you take pressure off the leg. So a lot of times if they have a moderate hamstring strain, you might see them on crutches. You might see them trying to, relieve the weight off of their leg. Recovery can vary with these. They could be back in 2 weeks. They could be back in 6 or 8 weeks. It really depends, but usually the majority of them return in about 2 games. They miss a couple games. They return in about 2 to 3 weeks. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes these things can linger, especially when you get the re-injury. This is the one that I think most oftentimes, this grade 2, where it's okay, but it's still pretty damaged. These are where you're going to see the most commonly re-injured because they're trying to rush back, and it is a more significant strain. So this is where you're looking at for when I see grade 2, I get my flashers go off a little bit. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a really tricky situation for probably the next month and a half.
So if you see something, I mean, do you pay attention? I mean, obviously we all look at the practice reports, but when they say that they're a partial participant in practice or they're just not practicing at all, if somebody's suffering from a hamstring strain, but they're still getting in, a partial practice, do you kind of just lean towards, all right, I don't want to take their word for it. I mean, they could just be going through walkthroughs. Or is that something where if they're limited participants, that more than likely they could be good to go on the weekend?
With other injuries, practicing, any kind of practicing is good. Partial, a full practice, no restrictions, That's what you're looking for. You're ideally looking for like Wednesday, Thursday, full practices, especially if you're going to play them on Sunday. If you go into Friday and they get a partial practice on Friday or a partial practice on Saturday, that does not really tell us that much. It's really kind of a red herring. Like a partial practice could mean that they sat on the bike for 30 minutes and they looked like they were out on the field, but they weren't really practicing at all. They're still really getting mostly rehab. If they don't practice at all, that means they can't do anything. That means they're only doing rehab. Those are ones where you really have to pay attention to. A lot more common with grade 3, these severe strains, which is a complete tear or a very significant strain. Typically, they have a lot of swelling. Bruising appears with this because it's a much deeper injury. Pain all the time. You can't rest it. You can't walk. I mean, it hurts all the time. Sometimes these require surgery, which obviously can impact players for a much longer length of time. Average, they miss about 6.5 games. So you're looking at almost 2 months when you get a grade 3 hamstring strain. But most likely, if this happens at the beginning of the season, you're looking at a trip to the IR. It's going to be a full 8 weeks, and you might not see that player again. I'm totally out on players. If they have a preseason grade 3 hamstring strain, I'm totally out. They're probably not going to play this year. They might play, but the re-injury risk is so high, it's just not worth taking on the risk. But yeah, the severe, you're going to see weeks of no practice. You might see them start to get some partial practices in and then still miss 2 or 3 more games just with partial practices before you actually see them play.
Right. So I'll bring up a little bit of a scenario here, and it'll kind of lead into how to handle it and how it looks for fantasy football. But say Will Fuller, for example. Now, he's somebody who's dealt with injuries. I feel like we always talk about Will Fuller. It doesn't matter what video we do. Will Fuller's name
Will Fuller is like, you just put his picture up. And
every
he
episode
be
about
the mascot
injury
of this series, honestly.
Yeah, he should. But to his level of a fantasy player, where he has that super high ceiling, but he can disappear at times. If Will Fuller were to have a severe hamstring strain, a grade 3 early in the season, do you worry about putting him on the IR, or do you just drop him and pick somebody up right there and just cut your losses?
I usually don't totally drop. If I have an IR spot, I use it, especially with a guy like Fuller, because you're probably going to have to invest. He's going like rounds 9 to 11, 12 right now in the draft that I'm seeing. So that's not a huge price to pay, but if you have an IR spot, use it. If you don't have any IR spots, I'm probably dropping him, to be honest. Just because short benches, it's just not worth it to me, because I don't think he's going to come back. Even if he does, let somebody else spin the fab. Maybe they get a game or 2, but for me, it's not worth just sucking up a bench spot on a guy that I know is probably not going to produce again this season with a significant hamstring strain. There's just not really much evidence that shows that they come back and they're effective.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, by the time you add in the re-injury risk to somebody who's already dealt with multiple injuries, it's kind of like a no-brainer. Like you said, if you don't have an IR spot, and it's not just for Will Fuller, there's a lot of guys, if you're taking them there in those later rounds and they suffer one of these injuries, I really don't want to put up with it all year long and just hope for it to get better. Cut your losses, find somebody on the waiver wire that has some upside to them, that has some potential to really take over second half of the year, and cut your losses. Now, obviously, if it's one of your first, second, third, fourth, fifth round picks, you probably want to hold on a little bit longer than you would with those guys at the end of the draft. They have a little bit more draft capital, and obviously they were drafted that early for a reason, right? They have that huge upside. They're a cornerstone of your team. Don't just give up on them right away, because if you do it too early, or you go off of a quick injury news and just make a quick decision, you could have yourself a problem if it comes out to be a little bit better than what they originally described. So you don't want to rush it with your studs.
Yeah, the only other strategy that I guess you could use from a fantasy perspective is if you're going to wait it out, trying to trade them when the hype is the most. They're getting ready to come back, and they're pretty sure they've been confirmed that they're going to play on Sunday. Then you try to flip them, and then you don't have to really worry about the risk so much, but you're going to get something back that might be more valuable than someone you get off a waiver wire. But even then, you're assuming that you have to be a good salesman. I mean, especially with somebody like Fuller that has a history, other players are going to know that you're trying to offload him. They're not going to give you what he's probably worth in a trade. But A minor strain that maybe becomes something more serious, then you could probably flip him for a little bit of value. Maybe a guy that you think, man, maybe he's not producing right now, or he disappoints for a few weeks, but still has the potential to make a huge second half jump. Last year, you're looking at a guy like Deebo Samuel. He wasn't really producing a whole lot. If you flipped him when Will Fuller hurt his hamstring and you got Deebo back, that is a league-changing move. That is a move that could potentially get you a championship. I'm not saying that you should, or that I know for sure who that guy's going to be this year, but those are the guys you're kind of looking for. Someone that's maybe disappointing but has opportunity.
Yeah, a couple of big names last year that we saw towards the end of the year. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, both of them suffering hamstring injuries. I don't know if it's something in the water in Tampa Bay. I don't know maybe Bruce Arians overworked them throughout the year. I don't know what it was, but those are two guys that really hurt a lot of people down the stretch with some hamstring injuries.
Yeah, they did. And they were both pretty severe hamstring. I mean, they basically immediately ruled them out. And that's another thing that you look for when you're looking at these injury reports after a guy gets hurt. How quickly do they rule them out the next week? If they rule them out immediately, it's pretty serious. Like they know they're not coming back in a week. With these two, Evans and Godwin, basically right after the game, they asked them and they're like, no, this is pretty serious. We're probably not going to see him again this year. So Godwin missed 2 weeks of the season. Could that have been more? Could he, if this had happened in week 7, could this have been an injury that took him totally out for the second half of the year? Potentially. So it's good to know going into this year that this has been in his history. I say it a lot. Injury history, best predictor we have of future injury. Could this be the start of something? I don't know. Godwin's history doesn't really show this as like a chronic issue yet, but it's important to note when you see something like this, that this guy is coming technically off of an injury. Mike Evans, same thing. It's funny how they got injured like literally a week after each other. Mike Evans was in week 14, Godwin was in week 15, and they both basically were out for the rest of the year. So, it's interesting, but it's definitely something that, at that point, you don't really have anything you can do. You're either in the championship or you're not. Yep. So it doesn't really make a difference to you too much unless you're in the championship and you lost the championship, which if you did, you should comment below because I feel bad for you and I want to hear about your suffering.
You want to capitalize off of other people's pain. You want to rehash last year's
I just want to know if it happened because I feel bad. I really do feel bad.
I'm sure it did. I'm sure there were some championship teams out there with Chris Godwin on the roster.
2 top 5 wide receivers. I think that would hurt a little bit.
I would think just a little bit, but now being that the season starts, second week of September-ish, that's a long way away from when these guys got hurt. You don't have any concerns as of right now going into the season. It's just that something to pay attention to for the possible re-injury. If they have a hamstring injury early this year, it may be one of those things where you shut it down early and cross them off your draft list.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just worth knowing. I think sometimes at the end of the year, the fantasy season's winding down. You're either out or you're in. And if you're out, you're probably not really paying attention as much anymore to all the teams. You might miss something like this. And so if you're going into this season and you see that in the preseason, you might think, oh, well, it's just, he just tweaked his hamstring. It's just like, it happens all the time. I said highest risk, first 15 days. Not really a big issue. But if you remember last year that they had this issue before, now we've got 2 in the course of a year. Maybe that thing didn't heal right. Maybe it hasn't healed completely and you're setting yourself up for a huge bust, which is not what you want. So again, everybody listening to this, everybody watching this knows that happened and now you're aware and you can watch out for those things. But those of you that did not could get yourself in trouble.
The last thing you want to do is get yourself in trouble because you didn't listen to us.
It's true.
I mean, it's just easy. It's free. It's free content. We're just giving you free information. And
I'm like the only doctor that gives stuff away for free.
That may be the truth. That's pretty close. The only doctor I know, anyway, that gives away stuff for free. And it's fun to sit here and talk about injuries. We've done a few of these shows already in the past. We've talked about individual players. We've talked about some injuries. We have some more that have come up in the comments. I know we've talked about concussions before. We've seen that in the comments section before. But if there's anything else out there, we've done ACL tears. I mean, we've talked about a few different injuries, trying to make sure that you guys, the viewer, are as educated as possible to set yourself up for some fantasy football domination in 2020 fantasy football. So Ethan, I greatly appreciate your time. This is another injury that we can check off the list. We've done it. We've taken care of it. We've talked about it, and we have helped the people out.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's one of those things where every time I look in the comments, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's like 5 more things that we need to talk about. So I'm not going to run out of content anytime soon. So that's good job security for me.
Yeah, exactly. You'll always have something to talk about, Ethan. No matter, as long as there's a sport going on, you'll have some injuries to talk about. But
That's right.
hopefully, you guys have a great rest of your week. We appreciate it, the support. Make sure you hit that like button and do it for Ethan because he's a doctor giving stuff away from free. I mean, come on, hit the like button for him. We greatly appreciate you guys. If you enjoy the content, hit that subscribe button. But for myself and Ethan, we'll talk to you later. Thanks. Have a good one.